Thaddeus Blackwell III stood at the edge of the helipad, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the rugged mountain landscape that surrounded him. The wind whipped at his silver hair, carefully styled to hide the receding hairline he refused to acknowledge. His steel-gray eyes narrowed as he surveyed the jagged peaks and dense forests stretching out before him. "Are you certain this is necessary, Mr. Blackwell?" His assistant, a nervous young man named Jeremy, shouted over the whir of the helicopter blades. "The board meeting isn't for another 3 days. We could easily fly back to New York and—" Thaddeus silenced him with a sharp wave of his hand. "I didn't build Blackwell Industries by playing it safe, Jeremy. This deal with the Chinese is too important to leave to chance. I need to clear my head, focus my thoughts. And there's no better place for that than right here." Without another word, Thaddeus strode towards the waiting park ranger, his Italian leather shoes crunching on the gravel. The ranger, a weathered woman in her 50s, eyed him skeptically. "Mr. Blackwell, I must advise against this," she said, her voice firm. "The weather report shows a storm system moving in faster than expected. It's not safe for a solo hike, especially for someone not accustomed to these conditions." Thaddeus felt a flare of irritation. Did this woman have any idea who she was talking to? He'd climbed Kilimanjaro, for God's sake. Admittedly, that was 20 years and 30 pounds ago, but still, he was Thaddeus Blackwell III. He didn't need anyone's permission or protection. "I appreciate your concern," he said, his tone making it clear he didn't appreciate it at all. "But I assure you, I'm more than capable of handling a simple day hike. I'll be back before the storm hits." The ranger looked like she wanted to argue further, but seemed to think better of it. She handed him a map and a small emergency kit. "Stay on the marked trails," she instructed. "If you're not back by sundown, we'll send out a search party." Thaddeus took the items with a curt nod and set off down the trail, ignoring Jeremy's anxious calls behind him. As he walked, he felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. This was exactly what he needed. Solitude, challenge, the chance to remind himself of his own strength and resilience. For the first hour, the hike was invigorating. Thaddeus breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the crisp mountain air. He mentally rehearsed his pitch for the upcoming meeting, imagining the looks of admiration on the faces of the Chinese investors as he outlined his vision for expanding Blackwell Industries into the Asian market. But as the trail grew steeper and the air thinner, Thaddeus found his thoughts wandering. He couldn't shake the memory of his son's face at their last meeting, the hurt and anger in young Theo's eyes as Thaddeus informed him he wouldn't be attending his college graduation. "The Shanghai deal is too important," he'd explained. "You understand, don't you?" Theo hadn't understood. Neither had Thaddeus's ex-wife, Eleanor. "He's your son, Thad," she'd pleaded. "Surely the company can survive without you for one day." But Thaddeus knew better. The company was his life's work, his legacy. Everything else, family, relationships, personal time, was secondary. It had to be. Didn't it? Lost in thought, Thaddeus didn't notice the darkening sky or the drop in temperature until the first fat raindrops began to fall. He looked up, startled to see angry gray clouds rolling in much faster than he'd anticipated. The wind picked up, carrying with it the first rumbles of distant thunder. Cursing under his breath, Thaddeus reached for the map in his pocket. But as he unfolded it, a gust of wind tore it from his grasp, sending it spiraling away into the gathering gloom. Panic rose in his throat as he realized he had no idea which direction he'd come from or how to get back to the helipad. The rain was coming down in sheets now, soaking through his expensive suit and plastering his hair to his forehead. Thaddeus stumbled forward, his leather shoes slipping on the muddy trail. He had to find shelter, had to get out of this storm before a blinding flash of lightning illuminated the world, followed almost instantly by a deafening crack of thunder. Startled, Thaddeus lost his footing. He felt a moment of weightlessness, a sickening lurch in his stomach, and then he was falling, tumbling down a steep embankment. Pain exploded through his body as he bounced off rocks and tree roots. He clawed desperately at the muddy slope, trying to slow his descent, but it was useless. Just before his head struck a large boulder, sending him into unconsciousness, a single thought flashed through Thaddeus Blackwell's mind: I should have listened to the ranger. When Thaddeus awoke, the first thing he became aware of was pain. His head throbbed, his ribs ached with every breath, and his left ankle felt like it was on fire. The second thing he noticed was that he was no longer cold and wet. He was lying on something soft, covered with warm blankets, and he could hear the crackle of a nearby fire. Slowly, painfully, he opened his eyes. He was in a small, rustic cabin. Rough-hewn log walls were adorned with handmade quilts and what looked like children's drawings. A pot bubbled over a stone fireplace, filling the air with the savory aroma of some kind of stew. "Oh, you're awake," a woman's voice, warm and tinged with relief, came from somewhere to his left. "Ezra, Cora, come quick, he's awake." Thaddeus turned his head, wincing at the movement to see a woman in her late 30s hurrying towards him. She had kind brown eyes and hair the color of wheat, pulled back in a simple braid. Behind her came a man about the same age, his face weathered and tanned, with a scraggly beard that couldn't quite hide his concerned frown. Two children peeked out from behind their father's legs, a girl of about 10 and a boy who looked to be around 7. "How are you feeling, mister?" the woman asked, pressing a cool hand to Thaddeus's forehead. "You gave us quite a scare, you know. Ezra found you half dead at the bottom of Miller's Ridge. You're lucky you didn't break your fool neck." Thaddeus tried to speak, but his throat was dry and raw. The woman seemed to understand, holding a cup of water to his lips. He drank gratefully, the cool liquid soothing his parched mouth. "Thank you," he managed to croak out. I don't know what happened. The storm ... "Worst spring storm we've had in years," the man, Ezra, said, shaking his head. "You're lucky to be alive. What in tarnation were you doing out there alone anyway? Don't you know how dangerous these mountains can be?" Under normal circumstances, Thaddeus would have bristled at being spoken to in such a manner. But lying there, battered and helpless, he found he didn't have the energy for indignation. "I thought I could handle it," he admitted. "I was wrong." The woman clucked her tongue sympathetically. "Well, you're safe now. I'm Mabel, by the way. This is my husband, Ezra, and our children, Cora and Jasper. What's your name?" For a moment, Thaddeus hesitated. These people clearly had no idea who he was. No idea that they'd rescued one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the country. Part of him wanted to tell them, to see the awe and respect he was accustomed to flash across their faces. But another part, a part he barely recognized, urged him to keep quiet. "Thad," he said finally. "My name is Thad." Over the next few days, as Thaddeus recuperated under Mabel's attentive care, he found himself drawn into the rhythms of the family's simple life. Ezra left each morning to tend to their small herd of goats and the vegetable garden that provided most of their food. Mabel homeschooled the children, their lessons often spilling out into practical demonstrations, using math to calculate feed ratios for the animals, or studying biology by examining the plants and insects in their yard. At first, Thaddeus was restless, fretting about the missed meeting and the deals that were surely falling apart in his absence. But as the days passed, he found himself relaxing into a pace of life he'd long forgotten existed. He watched in fascination as Cora patiently taught her younger brother how to whittle, her small hands guiding his as they shaped a piece of wood into a crude but recognizable bear. He listened with growing interest as Ezra explained the intricacies of predicting weather patterns based on subtle changes in the wind and the behavior of animals. And every evening, as the family gathered around the fireplace, Thaddeus found himself drawn into their easy conversation and genuine laughter. It was so different from the stilted, formal dinners he was used to, dinners where every word was calculated, every gesture a move in some complex game of social chess. One afternoon, about a week into his stay, Thaddeus sat on the porch, his injured ankle propped up on a stool. He watched as Jasper struggled to stack a pile of firewood, his small arms straining with each log. "Here, let me help," Thaddeus called out, starting to rise. But Mabel, who was hanging laundry nearby, stopped him with a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Let him do it," she said softly. "It's important for children to learn to do things for themselves, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Thaddeus frowned, But it would be so much easier if I just did it for him. Surely that would be kinder. Mabel shook her head, a knowing smile on her face. Easier, yes. Kinder, no. By letting him struggle a bit, we're teaching him that he's capable of overcoming challenges. That's a lesson that will serve him far better in life than having things handed to him. Her words struck a chord deep within Thaddeus. He thought of his own son, Theo, and all the times he'd smoothed the way for him, paying off teachers to raise grades, using his influence to secure internships and job offers. Had he really been doing Theo a favor? Or had he been robbing him of the chance to develop his own strength and resilience? As the days turned into weeks, Thaddeus found himself opening up to the family in ways he never had before. He told them about his own childhood, not the sanitized version he usually presented to the media, but the real story, the loneliness of growing up in a massive, empty house, the pressure to live up to his father's impossible standards, the gnawing fear that no matter how successful he became, it would never be enough. In return, the family shared their own stories. Ezra spoke of the hardships they'd faced when a particularly harsh winter had wiped out half their herd. Mabel recounted the joy and terror of giving birth to Cora in the middle of a blizzard, with only Ezra to help. The children chimed in with their own tales, triumphs and failures, fears and dreams. Thaddeus was surprised to find how much he enjoyed these simple exchanges. There was no agenda here, no hidden motives or carefully crafted personas. Just honest, open communication between people who cared about each other. As his body healed, Thaddeus began to help out around the homestead. At first, his efforts were clumsy and often did more harm than good. He nearly set the chicken coop on fire trying to change a light bulb, and his attempt at milking a goat left both him and the animal thoroughly traumatized. But the family never mocked him or grew impatient. Instead, they offered gentle guidance and encouragement. Slowly, Thaddeus began to improve. He felt a surge of pride the first time he successfully split a log for the fireplace, and the day he managed to help Cora birth a kid goat was one he knew he'd never forget. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table enjoying a meal of homemade bread and vegetable stew, Ezra cleared his throat. "Thad," he said, his voice serious, "Mabel and I have been talking. We know you must have a life to get back to, but, well, we wanted you to know that you're welcome to stay here. Permanently, if you'd like. We could use the extra help and, well, you've become part of the family." Thaddeus felt a lump form in his throat. The offer touched him deeply, more deeply than he could have imagined. For a moment, he was tempted. The thought of leaving this peaceful life, of returning to the cutthroat world of business and high finance, filled him with a sense of dread he'd never experienced before. But even as the temptation washed over him, Thaddeus knew he couldn't accept. His time here had changed him, yes, but it hadn't erased his responsibilities or his past. He had a company to run, employees who depended on him, and more importantly, he had a son to make things right with. "I'm honored," Thaddeus said, his voice thick with emotion. "More than you can know. But I have to go back. There are things I need to set right." The family nodded, understanding in their eyes. They didn't press him for details or try to change his mind. They simply accepted his decision, just as they had accepted him. The next morning, as Thaddeus prepared to leave, the family gathered to say goodbye. Mabel handed him a backpack filled with supplies for his journey back to civilization. Ezra gave him a hand-carved walking stick to help with his still tender ankle. Cora presented him with a bracelet she'd woven from goat hair, while Jasper shyly offered a smooth river stone he'd found, for luck. As Thaddeus shouldered the backpack and took a last look at the cabin that had been his home for the past month, he felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. These people had saved more than just his life. They had saved his soul. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You've given me so much, and I have nothing to offer in return." Mabel smiled, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "You've given us plenty, Thad. You've reminded us that there's goodness in the world beyond these mountains. That's a gift we'll always treasure." With final hugs and promises to write, Thaddeus set off down the mountain trail. As he walked, his mind was already racing with plans. He would call Theo as soon as he got back in cell phone range, beg for the chance to make things right. He would restructure Blackwell Industries, focusing more on ethical practices and employee welfare. He would use his wealth and influence to protect wilderness areas like the one that had sheltered him. But most importantly, he would never forget the lessons he'd learned from this simple mountain family. The value of hard work, the importance of genuine connections, the strength that comes from overcoming challenges rather than avoiding them. As Thaddeus rounded a bend in the trail, he caught sight of a search and rescue helicopter circling in the distance. Soon, he would be back in his world of wealth and power. But he was returning as a changed man, carrying with him the wisdom of the mountains and the love of a family who had asked for nothing in return for their kindness. He reached into his pocket, feeling the smooth contours of Jasper's lucky stone. With a smile, Thaddeus realized that he had indeed found something invaluable in these mountains. Not the clarity he'd originally sought for his business deals, but a new perspective on what truly mattered in life. The helicopter spotted him, beginning its descent. As Thaddeus waved to signal his location, he made a silent vow. He would return to this mountain someday, not as the arrogant, self-important man who had first climbed it, but as the humbled, grateful person he had become. And when he did, he would bring with him the greatest gift he could offer, the truth about who he was and how profoundly this family had changed him. For now, though, it was time to go home and begin the real work of transforming his life. As the helicopter touched down and the paramedics rushed towards him, Thaddeus took one last look at the majestic peaks behind him. He smiled, knowing that while he was leaving this place, he was carrying its essence within him. The next few hours passed in a blur of medical checks, debriefings, and a flurry of phone calls. Jeremy, his assistant, was beside himself with relief and anxiety. "Mr. Blackwell, sir, we've been searching for weeks. The board was about to declare you legally dead. The stock prices have been fluctuating wildly. And the deal with the Chinese investors..." Thaddeus held up a hand, silencing the young man's frantic report. "Jeremy," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I want you to cancel all my appointments for the next week and book me a flight to California." Jeremy blinked, clearly thrown by this unexpected command. "California, sir? But what about the emergency board meeting and the press conference?" "They can wait," Thaddeus replied, surprising himself with how little he cared about these once critical matters. "There's something more important I need to do first." As the private jet soared over the country, Thaddeus stared out the window, lost in thought. He fingered the rough-hewn bracelet on his wrist, a tangible reminder of the life he'd left behind in the mountains. The decision he was about to make went against everything he'd believed in for decades, but for the first time in years, he felt absolutely certain he was doing the right thing. The cab pulled up to a modest apartment building in a quiet Berkeley neighborhood. Thaddeus paid the driver and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, gathering his courage. Then, with a deep breath, he walked up to the intercom and pressed the button for apartment 3B. There was a long pause, then a crackle of static. "Hello?" A young man's voice, wary and slightly annoyed. Thaddeus swallowed hard. "Theo? It's your father." Another long pause. Thaddeus could almost feel the shock and confusion radiating through the intercom. Finally, the door buzzed open. Theo was waiting in the doorway of his apartment, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He'd grown a beard since Thaddeus had last seen him, and his hair was longer, tied back in a messy bun. He looked older, more mature, and undeniably angry. "What are you doing here?" Theo demanded, not moving to let his father in. "Shouldn't you be in some boardroom somewhere, making another $1 billion?" The words stung, but Thaddeus knew he deserved them. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see right now," he said softly. "But please, Theo, give me 5 minutes. That's all I ask." For a moment, Thaddeus thought his son might refuse, but then Theo stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter with a curt nod. The apartment was small but tidy, its walls covered with photographs and what looked like scientific posters. Thaddeus noticed a framed diploma on the wall, Theo's college degree, the graduation ceremony he'd missed. "I heard you were lost in the mountains," Theo said, his voice carefully neutral. "I guess they found you." Thaddeus nodded. "They did. But Theo, something happened up there. Something that made me realize how wrong I've been. About everything." Over the next hour, Thaddeus poured out the whole story. The storm, the fall, the family that had taken him in. He spoke of the lessons he'd learned, the perspective he'd gained, and most of all, he spoke of his regret. "I've been a terrible father," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I convinced myself that providing for you financially was enough, that it excused my absence in every other way. I was wrong, Theo, so wrong, and I know I have no right to ask this, but I'd like a chance to make it right, to be the father you deserve." Theo listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Thaddeus finished, the young man was quiet for a long moment. Then, to Thaddeus's surprise, Theo got up and went to his desk, returning with a stack of papers. "Do you know what these are, Dad?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. Thaddeus shook his head. "These are acceptance letters from every top graduate program in environmental science in the country." Theo's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "I've been trying to tell you for years. I don't want to run Blackwell Industries. I want to save the planet. I want to protect places like the mountains that saved you." Thaddeus felt a wave of shame wash over him. How many times had he dismissed Theo's interests as a phase? How often had he pushed his own dreams onto his son, never bothering to listen to what Theo actually wanted? "Theo, I had no idea," he said softly. "I'm so sorry. I should have listened. I should have supported you." Theo's eyes narrowed. "And now? Now that you've had some grand epiphany in the wilderness, are you going to support me? Or is this just another momentary change of heart before you go back to being the same old dad?" It was a fair question, and one Thaddeus had been asking himself. But looking at his son, seeing the passion in his eyes, the strength of his convictions, Thaddeus knew his answer with absolute certainty. "I want to support you, Theo, in whatever way you'll let me, and not just with money." Thaddeus leaned forward, his eyes intense. "What if we used Blackwell Industries to further your goals? We have the resources, the influence. We could make a real difference." Theo looked skeptical. "You'd do that? Turn your precious company into a force for environmental good?" Thaddeus nodded. "In a heartbeat, if you'll help me do it." For the first time since Thaddeus had arrived, a glimmer of hope appeared in Theo's eyes. "It won't be easy," he warned. "A lot of your board members and shareholders won't like it." Thaddeus smiled, thinking of Jasper struggling with the firewood. The most important things in life rarely are easy, but that doesn't mean they're not worth doing. Slowly, cautiously, Theo smiled back. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Over the next year, Thaddeus and Theo worked tirelessly to transform Blackwell Industries. There were setbacks and challenges, of course. Some board members resigned in protest. Certain shareholders sued. But as the company's new direction began to yield both profits and positive press, even the staunchest opponents came around. Blackwell Industries became a leader in sustainable technology and conservation efforts. Theo's expertise guided their investments in renewable energy and habitat restoration. Thaddeus's business acumen ensured that their good works were also good for the bottom line. But more important than the company's transformation was the healing of their relationship. Thaddeus learned to listen, truly listen to his son. Theo, in turn, began to see his father not as the distant, demanding figure of his childhood, but as a flawed, complex man capable of growth and change. It wasn't always smooth sailing. Old habits died hard, and there were arguments and misunderstandings. But through it all, both men held on to the lessons learned in those mountains. The importance of perseverance, of family, of staying true to one's values. One crisp autumn day, Almost exactly 2 years after Thaddeus's fateful hike, father and son stood together on a mountain trail. But this time, they weren't alone. With them were Mabel, Ezra, Cora, and Jasper, the family that had saved Thaddeus in more ways than one. Thaddeus had kept his promise to return and to tell them the truth about who he was. To his amazement, they had taken the news in stride. "We figured you must be somebody important," Mabel had said with a wink. "Nobody gets that worked up about a missed business meeting unless there are millions on the line." Now, as they all stood looking out over the valley, Thaddeus felt a profound sense of peace. He glanced at Theo, who was deep in conversation with Ezra about sustainable forestry practices. He saw Cora teaching Jasper how to use a compass, their heads bent together in concentration, and he realized that he had found something far more precious than the business deal he'd originally come to these mountains seeking. He had found a way to bridge the two worlds he inhabited, the world of wealth and influence, and the world of simple, honest human connection. As if reading his thoughts, Mabel sidled up next to him. "You know," she said softly, "when Ezra first brought you home, all battered and half frozen, I never would have guessed you'd end up changing our lives as much as we changed yours." Thaddeus raised an eyebrow. "How do you mean?" Mabel gestured to where Theo was now showing Jasper how to use a water testing kit in a nearby stream. "Your son's scholarship program has given our children opportunities we never dreamed possible, and that new solar grid you installed has made life up here easier than it's ever been." Thaddeus felt a lump form in his throat. "It's the least I could do," he said. "You gave me back my life, my relationship with my son. How could I ever repay that?" Mabel smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Well, you could start by helping me convince Ezra to let us visit you in the city sometime. I love these mountains, but I wouldn't mind seeing a Broadway show before I die." Thaddeus laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that echoed off the mountain peaks. "It's a deal," he said, offering his hand. Mabel bypassed it entirely, pulling him into a warm hug instead. As the group began to make their way back to the cabin for dinner, Thaddeus fell into step beside Theo. "You know," he said casually, "I've been thinking, maybe it's time I stepped down as CEO. Let someone with fresher ideas take the reins." Theo looked at him sharply. "Dad, if this is your way of pressuring me to take over..." Thaddeus held up a hand. "It's not. I promise. I was actually thinking, well, what if we created a new position, Chief Environmental Officer, someone to ensure that no matter who's in charge, the company stays true to its new mission?" Theo was quiet for a moment, considering. Then a slow smile spread across his face. "You know, that actually sounds perfect." As they crested a hill, the cabin came into view, smoke curling invitingly from its chimney. Thaddeus paused for a moment, taking in the scene. His son beside him, new friends ahead, and behind them the majestic peaks that had started it all. He thought about the man he had been when he first set foot on this mountain, driven, lonely, blind to the truly important things in life. And he marveled at the man he had become, still ambitious, still a force to be reckoned with in the business world, but now grounded in something deeper, something real. Thaddeus Blackwell III, the titan of industry who had lost everything on this mountain only to gain something far more valuable, smiled to himself. Then, with a lightness in his step that belied his years, he followed his newfound family down the trail towards home. In that moment, surrounded by the beauty of nature and the warmth of true human connection, Thaddeus knew that he had finally found the wealth he'd been searching for all his life. It wasn't in his bank accounts or his stock portfolios. It was here, in the love of his son, in the friendship of this mountain family, and in the knowledge that he was using his power and influence to make the world a little bit better. As they reached the cabin, laughter and the smell of Mabel's cooking spilling out to greet them, Thaddeus realized that his great misadventure had led him to the greatest fortune of all, the riches of a life well lived, surrounded by people who saw him not for his wealth or status, but simply for who he was. And in the end, that was worth more than all the money in the world.